Ah, another opportunity. Let me check in with Royal Experiment, The Private Life of King George III by Janice Hadlow. This is a 2014 book, hardcover, 704 pages, which I was pointed to by Sean the Book Maniac, who really loved this book, and I can tell why. Um, Let me start off by just reading the preces of this, and I can react to that. How far? I can't even remember how far I'm about three. I'm a good ways into it. I'm like 346, 347 pages. I'm up to the madness of King George the Third, which I can only think of the movie which starred the the guy from Yes Minister and what is her name? Helen Mirren, I believe, is as Charlotte. The surprising, deliciously dramatic, and ultimately heartbreaking story of King George III's radical pursuit of happiness in his private life with Queen Charlotte and their 15 children. In the US, Britain's George III is the protagonist of A Royal Experiment, is known in the US, Britain's George III, the protagonist of A Royal Experiment, is known as the king from whom the Americans won their independence and as the Mad King. But in Janice Hadlow's groundbreaking and entertaining new biography, he is another character altogether, compelling and relatable. He was the first of Britain's three Hanoverian kings to be born in England, the first to identify as a native of the nation he ruled. But this was far from the only difference between him and his predecessors. Neither of the previous Georges was faithful to his wife, nor to his mistresses. Both hated their own sons, and overall their children were angry, jealous, and disaffected schemers, whose palace shenanigans kick off Hadlow's juicy narrative and also made their lives unhappy ones. Pained by his childhood amidst this cruel and feuding family, George came to the throne aspiring to be a new kind of king, a force for moral good. And to be that new kind of king, he had to be a new kind of man. Against his irresistibly awful family background of brutal royal intrigue, infidelity, and betrayal, George fervently pursued a radical domestic dream. He would have a faithful marriage and raise loving, educated, and resilient children. The struggle of King George, along with his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their 15 children to pursue a passion for family, will surprise history buffs and delight a broad swath of biography readers and royal watchers. So there are things there that are accurate summation. His predecessors, his grandfather and great grandfather were interesting monarchs. The grandfather, the George, the first George, imprisoned his first wife in a castle for the rest of her life after having her divorced because she was carrying on affairs. He was carrying on affairs. That was fine. She that was like no, and she was imprisoned for the rest of her life there. Never got to see I think her her mother or was able to visit her, but that was it. That was it. She got imprisoned. So that's like George the first George just imprisoned his wife. The second George, they yes hated. It seems to be almost a structural thing that the Prince of Wales is becomes because he is so powerless becomes someone who just structurally ends up siding with the opposition to the king, the parliamentary opposition with the king, and that's where they get their powers from and feuding. And that doesn't stop. That does not stop with George III. George III, while he comes off at the beginning is kind of listed as a kind of a affable fellow and stuff like that, he was every bit as tyrannical a father of a father and patriarch of the family in general. Yeah, they super controlling. The sons could he and Charlotte, his wife, were who had to be completely submissive to his will. Charlotte did, were extremely withholding, extremely judging. They held their children to incredibly high standards and never, in a very British fashion, never, they were far more quick to express all the things that were wrong than to give, and then were very grudging in the, praise that they would give their children. The children never felt that they were good enough, which I guess if you want to talk about relatable, it's like, yeah, that sounds relatable to having British Scottish parents to this a child of British and a Brit and a Scot. Um, yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. But it did make for, the children seem to have had just sort of a hellish time of it. I mean, a part of it is that you get the sense of royals as kind of the proto of what's the life of a celebrity is now, and somebody who's born into this celebrity, who is always born. There's always someone watching within their camp. There's great documentation because Fanny Burney is one of their maids in waiting. Which, I mean, a part of it is, I guess, having a writer on your own side who is going to document things, but they were never out of the public eye and always had to have a front, always had to be performing. And even within their own palaces, seems to be inescapable there. So while George wasn't cheating on people, he was super controlling. He never, he refused to marry off his daughters. He sent all his sons away except for the Prince of Wales, who of course had to stay in the country. He sent them all away to other regions to, I don't know, toughen them up, or to just like, it seems like an ultimate just kind of rejection of them. Like, they were all super alienated from him. This was a incredibly brittle family. At which point, um, in the narrative that I have gotten to, George becomes deranged. There's a couple of theories that are put forward. Porphyria is one of them, which is a blood disorder. This one seems to have been kind of set aside. It had a great acceptance at one point, but now there seems to be enough doubt in the matter of that. It could be bipolar, or manic episodes, and the king has been taken out of power, and his son, the Prince of Wales, that they've completely alienated, and has been completely siding with opposition forces, most embarrassingly to the king, has taken control. Which that seems to squash things with this particular household. Suddenly, someone else is in charge. Someone else who has very deliberately been put outside of all this. Somebody who is has multiple mistresses, gambles, leads a dissolute life. And a part of that you can take as, there's personal responsibility. Another part of it is, how could this poor bastard become anything other than that? And he is now, I don't think he's legally been put in as the regent yet, but that's what's going to happen. This does seem to be a point in the history of Britain where we're slowly transitioning away from the king, how much power the king has. The king at this point does seem to be able to kind of select who the next government is to a degree. He can put together coalitions. That's why you have sort of the king's man being the first minister, but he, when he needs to get stuff through, he has to accept the other opposition for stuff. There is a section here of George was very much again the kind of the controlling father when it came to the American colonies, and refusing to negotiate. Like, the situation potentially didn't have to be an all or nothing of the Americans just, having a violent revolution and breaking away. There could have perhaps been a middle path, but George on his end was not interested in negotiating. And to be fair, the Americans were who were revolting, who didn't want the British taxation without representation on their side. The British seem to be like, we're taxing you, so it funds how much is protect your borders are protected, with the Americans saying, oh, you're just sucking the money from us because we're a colony, which probably has a kind of legitimate thing. It's the British didn't have colonies for the goodness of their own heart. They were eager to make money and economic gains off of that. Or else why would they have them? Why had they risen to such great heights? It was because of the wealth that was flowing in from colonies that they were using to fund the industrialization and stuff like that, which is also happening at these times. This is like in the 1700s, late 1700s, where, and we're going to get like, oh, do we get the French Revolution in here? I can't remember. It depends on what the years are for George the Third. So it is extremely engaging, but I don't know if it's one of these things of, it's relatable in the sense of, wow, I never want to be like my parents. And then you get to a certain point, and if you've got enough self-reflection, you realize, oh, fuck, I am repeating stuff that my parents did. And it just points out how difficult it is to break that, because except for the madness part, the George the Third is very much repeating what his predecessors did, though he definitely does have an idea that is sort of a kind of is a kind of a modern idea of, I am going to be a public figure that is going to be a symbol for moral good, like having a good, cohesive, loving family will set an example for the nation. And that is sort of a thing of celebrity. I see that as a celebrity thing of aspirational, of I want people to admire me and want to be me. And it's unfortunate that while George had that lofty goal, he ended up replicating a lot of the very repressive things of his predecessors, and fell victim to what seems to be mental illness at the same time as the maybe the media of the time was starting to rev up enough that they could report on and look to the royals as some sort of example, some sort of higher goal, at the very time where they're kind of just showing exactly how flawed and how human they are. Because boy, mental illness is nothing but, that's our, the frailties of humanity, right? Are there as much as the positives and the good stuff. I'm not much of a royalist, but it's a fascinating story. And oh God, medicine of the time. These were doctors who were trying to do all the best things. They thought that he had a humor in his head that they needed to drain back to his legs. So they were raising blisters on his legs, raising great giant blisters that would erupt and then would pour out pus, which they thought, that's the humor. Incredibly painful, and as Hadlow notes, also incredibly dangerous, because these were like horrible infections, which pre-penicillin or pre any antibiotics, you could easily die from one of these infections. So fascinating book. I'm really glad that Sean put me onto it, and I will go read it now because it's lunchtime. More videos later.